All right, guys, so we have a little bit more on World War II to cover. We've covered a lot of detail, of course, on how the war started, the appeasement policy, all of that, of course, material you need for your next quiz. We had talked about the battles, of course, Battle of France, Battle of Britain. We spent a bit of time on D-Day. And we did talk a little bit about how the war started in the Pacific, all the way up to Pearl Harbor, and then we talked about how the war ended in Europe after the D-Day invasion. And so what I want to just kind of cover in this lecture is how the war ends in the Pacific and how that finally comes to an end, taking us to the official end of World War II. This, of course, the USS Arizona Memorial in Hawaii. All right, so this is just our map again, just to kind of remind us what we were talking about. And what we know is that Japan had a very strong, firm control over the Pacific. They had moved into China, Southeast Asia, a lot of the islands, of course, all this region here. They're going to obviously make inroads into the Philippine Islands that were controlled by the United States. There's going to be a lot of conflicts throughout the Pacific, especially the North Pacific Ocean. And so there's several battles. I'm not going to go into tremendous detail on these battles, but there are a couple of them that I'm going to kind of point out here. The Battle of Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway are a couple that I usually like to talk about. So let me go to our maps again and talk about these. So here's Battle of Coral Sea and Midway. Coral Sea is down here in the South Pacific, right next to Australia. And Midway is really in the middle of nowhere, right? Hence the Battle of Midway. So both of these battles were fought in 1942. And I think what's interesting about these battles is how quickly the American military was able to rebuild after Pearl Harbor and how quickly we're able to bring reinforcements to the Pacific to fight against the Japanese forces there. The Battle of Coral Sea, I kind of just to briefly summarize it, was when Japan was trying to move further south. One of the areas Japan wanted to take over was Australia. It's kind of cut off on this map here, but of course, all down here is Australia. And they wanted Australia as well. And you go, wow, can they take over Australia? Remember, Australia is not that heavily populated. So they thought if they can get through Coral Sea, then they can get down to Australia. Well, that doesn't happen. They're pushed back. Battle of Midway, another one of these battles that's really about naval supremacy, right? Who's going to have the stronger Navy and Air Force and all of that? And once again, the U.S. was able to push Japan back. So this is an important point in the war in 1942 in the Pacific front of the war because this is kind of the moment where Japan has basically been doing what they wanted to do since the start of before the start of World War II, right? They were moving throughout this area in a very imperialistic manner, and now they're stopped. Now they still control a lot of areas, they still dominate a lot of Pacific regions, and so it's hardly the end of the war, but at least they're slowed down. And so that's why the battles of Coral Sea and the battles of Midway are important. If you ever go to San Diego, there's a ship there called the Midway. It's an aircraft carrier. It's really cool. It's a and it was actually commissioned just as World War II was ending, and then it was used, I think, until the first Gulf War, I believe. And you look at when it was built in the 1940s, and then you go, wow, this thing's massive if you ever go and see it, and it's tiny compared to the aircraft carriers we have today. So if you ever get a chance to go to San Diego, it's a museum now. You can tour it. It's pretty cool, actually. So anyways, those two battles, just kind of be familiar with them, know where they are, just a couple little things I said about each one of them. One of the other things that begins to happen in the Pacific Front that we always need to mention World War II are the kamikazes. And this was a big part of the Japanese mentality during World War II. So I have two photos for you here. This is a photo of a kamikaze plane literally just about to hit a ship, an American ship. And can you imagine a guy taking that photo? Wow. And it did hit the ship. It didn't do much damage, but that was one. I believe that was the Missouri. And this is another one just kind of from above, trying to kind of crash down into an American ship. So these kamikazes, kamikaze translates to divine wind, we're going to start being used as World War II progresses in the Pacific, and Japan is starting to see that the American forces are getting the upper hand. Not only did the kamikazes, which were planes that would purposely crash and commit suicide onto these American ships, they actually even experimented with human torpedoes, where they're from their subs they would fire a torpedo that had a person in it that would then steer the torpedo to try to hit it. So they would die, of course. And why am I mentioning this? Well, this is going to go into another important point as we move on in the Pacific and what Japan was willing to do to fight. You know, one of the mottos in Japan during World War II was it's better to die than surrender. And so that was part of the thinking during the time. All right, so you have the kamikazes, wanted to show you that. Then we get to two more battles. We jump ahead a bit to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, two very famous events during World War II. Now we're jumped ahead to 1945. What are Iwo Jima and Okinawa about? Well, at this point, you know, by 1945, the United States has, you know, pretty much got, control of the war in Europe and now in the Pacific. But Japan still dominated a lot of these areas. There were a lot of American soldiers still being held captive. There was a lot of casualties still taking place. And the United States was thinking, well, if we're going to end this war with Japan and make Japan give up control of all the land they take over, we kind of have to do what we did, what we're going to have to do in Europe, right? D-Day, June 6th. And so to do that, you can't just launch. Remember, D-Day was launched from England. They had a base. Where are you going to launch that base from? Where are you going to launch an invasion of Japan from? Well, you have these islands, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, right? And what's the deal with these islands there? Well, here's Iwo Jima, here's Okinawa. I know they're a little small to see there. But these islands are important because they have airfields. That's the key thing to remember, that they have airfields. And so the United States is going to fight these battles at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, and the United States wins these battles. The problem is they're very bloody, very much hand-to-hand combat, very brutal. And fighting these islands, there were tens of thousands of casualties and or deaths on both sides, fighting over these two little specks of land that you could barely see on the map here. So we already talked about the kamikaze. Now you have these events at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. It's now becoming very clear that any invasion of the Japanese mainland to break Japanese control of the Pacific was going to be incredibly bloody. And that's something that Iwo Jima and Okinawa were important for as well. So I think the two most important things to remember about those battles is one, they were fought because they have airfields, and two, just the bloody nature of those conflicts I think is important to note as well. Again, if you take a U.S. history class, you should learn much more detail on these battles than in a Western Civ class. That's why I focused a lot more Battle France, Battle Britain, previous lectures, but I still want you to know this material, of course. All right, and of course, this is a very famous image, the flag raising there. One of the most famous images that we associate with World War II. And this is the flags at Iwo Jima that, of course, were raised. And one of the things that people always talk about this flag raising is it's a very iconic image. Almost everyone has seen it before. One of the interesting points about it is that this image that's so iconic was not exactly fake. It really happened, but it was then redone. So the story goes that the bunch of Marines lifted this flags up and a photographer saw it and snapped a little picture. And he goes, oh, that was really cool. Can you do that again, but with a bigger flag so I can get a better picture? And this is the image you're seeing. This very iconic image was not the initial photo. It was then snapped again later with a bigger flag and so forth. There's a really good book called Flags of Our Fathers. Kind of tells the whole story of this, and it's a pretty cool little story actually if you ever get a chance to pick it up. Another really good book about the Pacific Front, if you've never read it, they made a movie about it, is the book called Unbroken. The book was much better than the movie. I forgot the authors actually. But Unbroken is a great story of this true story of an American athlete, Olympic star, prominent, who's going to be able to be in the Olympics. The war broke out. He gets caught up in the war. His plane gets shot down. He gets captured by the Japanese. And the things they do to them is amazing. One of the more horrific events that is associated with what Japan did was the Bataan Death March. If you're not familiar with that, you don't need to know any details about it in this class, but something to definitely look up just to get a sense of the brutality involved those American soldiers. So those are just a couple things I always mention: Flags of Our Fathers, Unbroken, just good sources on World War II if you want, in the Pacific, if you want to do some more reading from a kind of a novel perspective of things. All right, and the Bataan Death March was, again, that was in the Philippines, where just American soldiers were marched to death, and it was really horrific. So these are all things going on there as we get into 1945. And so then as we get into 1945, we win Iwo Jima, we win Okinawa. Now what? Well, let's talk about now what. Operation X Day, and then the use of the atomic bomb. So the United States, maybe, I don't know if any of you ever heard of Operation X Day. Probably never did because it never happened. So President Truman is now the president of the United States. Remember, Franklin Roosevelt dies April 45. So Truman is the president, and he is told, well, we could do a land invasion of Japan. And Japan at the time had about 6 million men ready to fight on Japanese territory. And Truman was told we'd probably win, but it's going to be very bloody, maybe 1 million American casualties. Where did they get that number from? Well, Kamikazes, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, right? All of those things, and it came to this idea that this is how many American casualties and how many more millions of casualties of Japanese forces would happen. And so Truman was told, well, we have another option. And of course, the other option were the atomic bombs. So let's talk about this a little bit. So the deal is with the atomic bombs is that these bombs that are going to be used will be the bombs that end World War II. Before the atomic bombs were ever dropped, we had firebomb Tokyo with more conventional weapons. And those fire bombings over Tokyo and Japan, this is going to surprise a lot of people, killed more people than the atomic bombs. Uh, the reason we kind of focus on the atomic bombs, obviously, is because the nature of one bomb being able to do this much damage, and the fact that these singular bombs are what's going to end the war. But there were actually more people killed from other bombings that we did prior to the atomic bombs. Japan didn't surrender. So Truman said, well, I need to save American lives. We'll go ahead and do the atomic bombs. Now, the way this worked, it's different than today. Today you have ICBMs. Back then, you had to get the bomb there. So there was a ship called the Indianapolis that was sailing the bombs across the Pacific Ocean. It delivered the ships to the base where they were then going to be put on a plane, and then Enola Gay, and then dropped. Right after it delivered the atomic bombs to Indianapolis, it was sunk by the Japanese. So can you try to imagine that? What would that meant for history if that didn't happen? So anyways, the bomb makes it there. It gets on the plane, the Enola Gay, and then the Enola Gay takes off and drops the first bomb in August of 1945 on the city of Hiroshima. Why Hiroshima? Well, it was a shipyard factory. But of course, this is an atomic bomb. You blow up a shipyard factory, it's going to kill, countless numbers of people everywhere nearby. Specifically, give you some numbers here. The Hiroshima bomb killed about 150,000 people. Okay, 150,000 people were killed by the Hiroshima bomb. Not all an immediate bomb, but combined. After the Hiroshima bomb, Japan still didn't surrender. And one of the things I read about is that they only thought we had one. They go, well, there's no way they have more than one of these type of explosive devices, right? And so at that point, Japan said, well, we're still not going to agree to an unconditional surrender. So 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. That bomb killed another 60,000 people. And it was after the second bomb that Japan thought, well, if they have two of these, then they must have an all arsenal. And then Japan was willing to have this unconditional surrender after the second bomb. What they didn't know is we didn't have any other bombs ready to go. Japan didn't know that at the time. So these two bombs combined killed about 200,000 people, a lot of which were civilians, which of course leads to a very important discussion where were these bombs justified? And this is where historians have different interpretations and ideas. Of course, many people would say, well, Japan didn't surrender. And you're in the middle of a World War II. You had the Bataan Death Marches. American soldiers were being killed. The job of Truman is to save American lives. And, a land invasion would have been more brutal. And this may have saved lives. That's one of the arguments. Another argument is, well, if you gave it a little bit more time, Japan would have surrendered. There would have been some casualties in the fighting, not as many. And Japan would eventually have surrendered, and maybe the atomic bombs may have not been needed to be used. Another argument is if the atomic bombs weren't used, ready for this one? The Soviet Union may have invaded Japan. The Soviet Union was fighting a two-front war as well, Germany and Japan. And can you imagine the Soviet Union invading Japan with Stalin's mentality of two men with one gun, and and then the Japanese mentality of it's better to die than surrender? What would have happened? So there are these different interpretations and ideas, and that's what history is very often. Again, at the end of the day, the bombs did end the war, and that's something we know for certain. That is just an absolute fact. And after that, Japan's entire society was forever changed. So these atomic bombs were used and did end the war. Now, there is another idea about the atomic bombs, which is why were they used other than ending the war? Could there have been another motivation? And the answer, sometimes people who study this as well say, well, the Cold War is about to start. And using the atomic bomb as a signal to the Soviet Union, hey, we're willing to use this bomb as the Cold War, which is going to be lectures we're going to move on shortly, was just about there to begin. So that might be part of it as well. So there's a lot of different things to think about in terms of the atomic bombs being used. But at the end of the day, it did end the war, and World War II now ends in the Pacific as well. All right, there's a couple of things I always like to talk about that I think important. And one of the other important elements of the Pacific is this idea, and again, this is much more for a U.S. history class, but I always mention it. I have this book called Farewell to Manzanar. I don't know if you could see it well. Farewell to Manzanar is a good book written by a young girl who was living in one of what were the Japanese internment camps. So what are the Japanese internment camps? I'm hoping you already know about this. But this was during World War II when President Roosevelt, let me read this to you, February 19th, 1942, President Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066 that giving the War Department authority to define military areas in Western states and exclude from them anyone who might threaten the war effort. So, that was Roosevelt's executive order that said anyone in the Western states that might threaten the war effort needs to be moved away. And this, of course, leads to the Japanese internment camps. The Japanese internment camps, however, did not just go, just go find people who were legitimate threats. Were there legitimate threats? Yeah, but this is not what happened. This was when civilians were taken, young men, boys, girls, old, and put in these internment camps. And they were held there during pretty much the entire course of World War II without any rights, any due process of the laws. And this was one of the more, terrible things in American history that happened during the Roosevelt administration. And, I always mention this. I always say, read Farewell to Manzanar. But I also make one other really important point because I've seen people make this mistake. Some people have called these concentration camps. They're not concentration camps. There's a difference, right? The internment camps, people were interned, they were taken. It doesn't justify anything that happened. Internment camps were, again, an act of moral bankruptcy in the United States at the time. There's no way around that. It was an absolute failure at that point in the U.S. And again, if you've listened to the last lecture, as much as you can praise the U.S. for what we did in D-Day and so many American lives that were sacrificed for freedom, this was a mistake. There was no doubt about it. But they weren't concentration camps. People were not taken there to be slaughtered and put in gas chambers. And it's very important that we use accurate language, right? Because if you call this a concentration camp, then what's a concentration camp? And then people think, oh, it takes away from what really happened. The United States did apologize for these during the Ronald Reagan administration, and during the older President Bush administration, reparations were actually made to people who went through the Japanese internment camps, not to their kids, not to their grandkids, not to their great-grandkids, obviously, but anybody who was in an internment camp did receive financial reparations. So that happened, 1980s roughly? So that would happen. And then little known, not as big, but not as many in terms of numbers, where there were German and Italian camps as well for civilians in the United States during World War II. A lot of people, I didn't actually even know about this when I started to teach. I remember years ago, and the students actually said, well, but the Japanese, the German and Italian ones, like, and then I looked it up, and sure enough, they weren't nearly as big in numbers, but they were there as well. So I always mention the Japanese internment camps. Again, definitely something more in a U.S. history class worth learning about, but even though it's a Western Civ class, I want you to know about that as well. So again, farewell to Manzanar. Manzanar was one of the more well-known internment camps, and there were a lot of them in California because, of course, we're in the Pacific area. Okay, we move on. And kind of the last major topic I want to cover here is the Holocaust. I don't spend a lot of time on this because one of the required things you have to do is watch Schindler's List. You're going to watch that. It's going to essentially be the last thing you're doing in this class. And it is required. If you don't do it, you lose a whole grade in your class, right? So I don't spend a lot of time on the lecture because Schindler's List is an amazing movie that really covers a lot of the events and the feelings and the time of the Holocaust. So what's going on here? Well, the first thing is you have a few things I always mention. Did people know about the Holocaust as it was happening? And the answer to that is yes. People knew as it was happening. It wasn't one of these things that people knew about it later. One of the stories that I always put a couple names here is what did people do? Well, there's a couple names, Pius XII and the St. Louis. Who's Pius XII? Pius XII was the Pope at the time. And Pius XII basically did nothing about the Holocaust. He took a position of neutrality on the Holocaust. And this has really kind of created a bad mark for the Catholic Church. Eventually, another Pope, John Paul II, apologized for this and said the Catholic community failed in protecting the Jewish people. And you go, if the Pope says something, would that help? And the answer is yes. If you're Catholic, and there are a lot of Catholics in Europe, and you're a practicing, believing Catholic, if the Pope says you're going to hell if you put a 5-year-old in a gas chamber, that make people, it doesn't stop the Holocaust, but it may make people think twice before they do what they did. And so, there were people who tried to kill Hitler because of their Catholic beliefs, because they knew, their religious view says Hitler is an evil man. But the Pope was too silent on this. And that's an example of somebody who was just silent, allowing this to happen. The St. Louis was a ship of Jewish people leaving Europe, trying to make it to the United States, and the Roosevelt administration just turned them away and said, no, we're not letting you here. And again, I think I made this point in the other lecture, this is before there was a state of Israel. The Jewish people didn't have a place that they could go to yet. The state of Israel is about to be created after the war, but they didn't have a safe haven. And there were Jewish people moving into this, what will become the state of Israel, but it was still controlled by the British. The British were limiting immigration there, and so there was no one, very few people. I shouldn't say no. There was very few people that were willing to protect. That's why the movie Schindler's List is such a powerful movie, and I want you to watch it and make sure you're familiar with it. The other thing is I posted something I want you to look at, the Milgram experiment. This is pretty intense stuff. And the Milgram experiment really kind of gives you a pretty profound way on how people think, the psychology of why people did what they did during the war. And the line I was just quote unquote following orders, how easily people are willing to follow orders is stunning without looking at what's really going on around them. And how easy people just come to fear and so forth. So that's a very important little video to watch, the Milgram experiments. Kind of watch that. It's very self-explanatory, I think, when you see it. So you have that. And then another excellent book I always recommend is this guy, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. He is a Holocaust survivor who was a psychiatrist. And he wrote this really powerful book about the psychological elements of the war. And definitely read it. I've never had a student read this book and go, oh man, I wasted my time. Everybody who's read this book comes back and says it had a profound impact on my life, because he talks about, so many powerful ideas in there. He talks about ideas like, how there were moments in the camps where people thought the camp was going to be liberated. And as they thought the camp was going to be liberated, they're like, oh, the next day the camp's going to be liberated. And the next day comes and the camp's not liberated, and then they die because they lost their will to live. That's how powerful psychology is on people. Or he talks about how a guy was having a nightmare, and he's about to wake up from a nightmare, and then he realizes, why am I going to wake this guy up from a nightmare? I'm in a camp with him. No matter what nightmare he's having, it's not as bad as the reality of the camp. And then he talks about how even in the camps, people were able to find happiness, which is really amazing. And this is this whole idea that Viktor Frankl's probably most core idea, if you know anything about his work, is that you are responsible for your own kind of happiness in life, in the sense that you can't control what happens, but you control how you react to what happens in your life. And that's a very powerful idea I always share with all my students, and it's from Viktor Frankl's view. And then one more point he makes in here, and I think this is also such an important point in society, and that is that he says after viewing the Holocaust, there are only two races in the world: the race of the decent man and the race of the indecent man. And I think that is so true as well. So many people are so, divided in terms of race, and he's like, yeah, you know what? There's only, the race of the decent man and the race of the indecent man. So it's a really good book. Pick it up, read it if you get a chance to. And just a few other just suggested reading. I'm not going to quiz you on the material in it, right, or anything, but definitely important things. All right, so that's a bit on World War II. We covered a lot in the other videos in this one, so hopefully you have a lot of good information. It's a major topic that I could even spend much more time on, but at least I give you hope some really important things to think about it, and I hope you found it interesting. So we have, of course, just one more real big topic to cover in this class, and that's the Cold War. And so what happens is World War II is ending, the Cold War is beginning, and we'll of course spend a bit of time talking about that, and that will wrap up the material for the semester. So thank you very much. Meanwhile, you should be also starting to study for your finals, right? Your IDs and your essays are there and available. So if you haven't been working on that, definitely be working on that. It's going to be coming up real quick, and that's it. All right. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you, everyone.